The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been dissected in all kinds of predictable ways, as a clash of rights, as a colonialist injustice, as a case of virulent anti-Semitism. But one dimension that has escaped a wider public attention is the way the conflict remains unsolved because of the psychological dimension. Could psychiatry help when other disciplines have shown themselves to be less than effective? To help us diagnose the problem, we welcome Carlo Strenger, who is chair of the clinical graduate program at the Department of Psychology at Tel-Aviv University. He's also the author of The Fear of Insignificance, and he's a columnist for Haaretz newspaper in Israel. And we welcome you to TVO. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be here.
Let us imagine the impossible. The United Nations declares that Israel, writ large, and Palestine, writ large, have to undergo collective psychotherapy. And you are in charge, doctor. You are the lead psychotherapist on this. So can we talk about, as you look for solutions, collective psychologies at play here?
We can certainly make use of a lot of psychological theory and knowledge and experience in order to understand the conflict better. I am somewhat doubtful that being in charge of this as a therapeutic project, I would be very successful, but I'll be very happy to say what I would do if in our thought experiment. You see, first of all, these are two groups that both come with a very heavy baggage of very traumatic experiences. I'll start with the Palestinian side. The Palestinians have a long history of being ruled by external forces. We're not going to go back to the 15th century. Let's say, begin with there was still the Ottoman Turkish Empire, then there was the British Mandate, and then, of course, there was the Zionist movement and the gradual dispossession of Palestinians of their lands. And for them today, the major trauma that they're speaking about is what they call the Nakba, the catastrophe, the expulsion of roughly 750,000 Palestinians from their homes in the 1948 war that Israelis called the War of Liberation and Independence. Yeah. And there is a lot of pain involved there. There is our traumas, our losses as individuals and as groups very much define our identities. And one of the things that I think is making it very difficult for Palestinians to truly accept the idea of compromise is that they still feel very attached to things, land, places, homes that they have lost. And that is a pain that is very, very real for them, and that needs to find a place if compromise is to be possible.
I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here because I do want to touch on this some more. But since you've raised it, yes, the Palestinian groups certainly talk about 1948 as a catastrophe for them. Israelis, on the other hand, will respond, don't get into a competition with us about hardship, misery, victimhood, etc. We've had the worst situation in the history of the world with the Holocaust during the 1930s and 40s. So there we are, competing narratives of victimhood. What do you do with that?
It's not just competing narratives, because often, when we say competing narratives of victimhood, it kind of sounds as if each side is kind of inventing its traumas, pains, history, etc. In this case, there are objective historical facts. And here, of course, both the pain on both sides and the fear on both sides and the rage in many cases on both sides is very, very real. As you mentioned, of course, the Israeli side has its own narrative. The Holocaust, we can go way back, starting with the Spanish Inquisition or the Crusades or whatever. The Jewish history of suffering is well documented, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, what the Palestinians are going to say is, this has nothing to do with us. We weren't responsible for the Holocaust. We weren't responsible for your expulsion from Spain in 1492, et cetera, et cetera. Israelis will answer, well, you had a chance in 1947 when the UN proposed a petition plan to agree to it. And instead of doing that, you joined the all-Arab attack on Israel. And you know what? That was your decision, and you lost. And in 1967, you joined again when our Arab neighbors tried to annihilate Israel, and you pay a price for your mistakes. So it is not only a matter of, past suffering, it's also that each side feels that the other side bears most of the responsibility for the status quo, which has become so impossible, unbearable, and seemingly irresolvable.
But let's talk about fear for a second, because you and I, just before we went on, talked about Ari Shavit's new book, My Promised Land, which he was here several weeks ago talking about it. And I'll just read the first line of the book. It says, "For as long as I can remember, I remember fear, existential fear." So what is the psychological effect on a group of people who feel that every day of their lives?
Well, that we have very good research on. What generally happens is that people become more deeply entrenched in their own world. They become less tolerant to really see other viewpoints, and they are willing to be more violent in order to defend their existential, the basis of their existence. Now, you see, I would say that, if you allow me to go into politics for a minute, I think one of the major sins of Israel's right-wing governments and movements has been that the external world has come to see Israeli fears as just a political ploy. It's just a way to justify further colonization of the West Bank, further settlements, etc., etc. And I think, the overwhelming majority of Israelis don't really want either the occupation or the West Bank, but the fears are real, and the questions are real. And the question, for example, when Netanyahu, whom I'm not exactly supportive of, but when he says, we cannot afford that Al-Qaeda fighters or Al-Qaeda associated fighters will be 20 kilometers from Tel Aviv, that sounds like paranoia. But half a year ago, Israeli TV actually filmed from the Golan Heights, from the Israeli border, Al-Qaeda affiliated fighters just, half a kilometer from the Israeli border.
So he's not wrong.
It's certainly the fears of Israelis are not as overblown as many of Israel's critics believe, or often state as if Israel was just Belgium that for some unintelligible reason attacks Luxembourg that has never done anything to it. Now, on the other hand, it is, of course, absolutely clear that the Palestinians, the situation of the Palestinians, certainly in the occupied territories, is untenable. Their freedom of movement, their political rights are being infringed every day. And then, of course, there are the millions of refugees that are scattered all over the Arab world. And their suffering is exactly as real as the as the fear of Israelis. As you notice, you asked me how I would treat that problem. For the time being, I'm giving you a diagnosis that primarily shows how enormously difficult it will be to find a solution.
Let's look at the other side of the diagnosis then. If most Israelis wake up every day thinking fear of Arab terrorism, fear of Iran, what do Palestinians wake up with every day?
I think primarily rage and humiliation.
Humiliation.
Yeah, I mean, if you cannot leave if you cannot take a flight without having to apply for an exit permit by Israelis, and if you're being strip searched at Ben Gurion Airport, etc., this is not going to exactly make you like Israelis, to put it very, very mildly. And I think that I can very easily understand this rage and humiliation. And of course, rage and humiliation are not exactly states of mind that make you more willing or more easily willing to go for compromise.
I'm not going to push this comparison too far, but humor me for a second here. Canadians partly identify who they are by saying, we're not Americans. It's very important as part of who we think we are to think that we're not like them. Israelis and Palestinians, I suspect, harbor similar identifying features on an exponentially larger scale because your two peoples have been at war for so long. What are the psychological implications for two peoples who think of themselves in some respects as not them?
Let me complicate the picture a little bit, because you see, I have cooperated in a number of networks and institutions with many Palestinians. And there are many, since my own worldview is very much defined by the global human rights paradigm, and I know many Palestinians who think in similar ways. I actually wouldn't say that I primarily define, or people like myself, and there are lots of them in Israel, primarily define ourselves by not being Palestinian. And I don't think that those Palestinians that I cooperate with, do research with, interact with, etc., primarily identify themselves as by not being Israeli. But yet, on a broad level, you're of course right. I think the main impact is something that has very practical implications. You see, very paradoxically, both on Israel's extreme right and both on the more radical sides of Palestinians, there are people who say the two-state solution is passé, it's over, it's done, it's a stupid idea, we need one state. And one of the psychological implications of the depth of the chasm of the mutual hatred, distrust, and defining oneself by not being the other always leads me to the point to ask both the extreme Israeli right and the Palestinians who think there should be one state, could you explain to me how the first session of Parliament of the unified Israelstein, or whatever you're going to call it, is going to look like, what flag it's going to be, which hymn they're going to sing, what symbols they would have in common. So one of the implications is that I think that for many decades to come, these will be groups that will find it very, very difficult to be very closely associated together in common frameworks. In which case, let's come back to where we started at the beginning, where we talked about these competing narratives of victimhood, Holocaust versus Nakba. We've revisited this topic numerous times on our program, and several weeks ago we had a professor from California come on, George Bisharat, who, when I asked him, how much longer is this going to go on, he said, oh, I'm sure there'll be peace in 30 years. 30 years. Ari Shavit, said, it feels impossible for Jews to just sort of get over the Holocaust, even though at one point in his book he asked the Palestinians to, in essence, get over the Nakba. You've got to get over this. You've got to get past this whole history of victimhood. Are these two peoples who are simply too mired in past injustices to see a future? Do you ask me what I think or what I want to think? Go ahead. Look, I am, in my function as political commentator, I am very much identified with the two-state solution because I think that the two-state solution maybe, it's not ideal. We don't live in an ideal world, but it would be the one way to kind of balance the traumas of both sides in a way that might be livable. If we don't get there, I very much hope that Professor Bisharat's prediction that we'll have peace in 30 years will not turn out to be optimistic. 30 years might be too soon. Well, again, if we don't, I think we are at a point where this could also escalate in ways that would actually even traumatize both sides even more deeply. Starting with, another war in which Hezbollah would bombard Israel, starting with more attacks by Hamas, and of course Israeli reprisals, which would produce countless victims. In this case, I think our only task is to maintain hope and work towards something, even if we have very good reasons to believe that it's almost impossible to achieve. Let me try this then. I gather with therapy, one of the ways you make a breakthrough is that you've got to acknowledge some kind of painful truth in your life. Mm-hmm. What are the painful truths that you think both sides have to acknowledge in this crisis before solutions can be found? I think I'll start with the Jewish side. I think most Israelis have enormous trouble accepting that, like most nation states, Israel has come into existence by causing a tragedy to another people. And I think that That's true for Canada. It's true for the United States. It's true, again, if you go through the history, for pretty much every nation state. Israelis need to be able to understand that even if we take responsibility for what we have done to the Palestinians, it doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have the right to exist. For Palestinians, I think it is to realize that with all the pain and all the victimhoods, they are in part authors of their own fate. They have enormous difficulty accepting how many faulty decisions they have made. They have enormous difficulty accepting that they, in the 1920s, chose the Husseini family to lead them. They don't want to be reminded of the fact that Hajj Amir al-Husseini actually created a battalion for the Waffen-SS that was supposed to cooperate with, once Hitler would have marched into Palestine, with exterminating the Jews there. They want to forget that they started the Second Intifada and very much contributed to the breakdown of the Oslo process. I think the Palestinians will have to accept that they have more responsibility for their fate than the narrative of pure victimhood entails.
Which may explain why we're still 30 years away from any potential solution, because it doesn't sound like those are truths that either side is prepared to yet acknowledge. Yes?
Let me put it this way. As a citizen, an activist, and columnist, I'm continued to work, live, and write as if it can be achieved more quickly. As an intellectual and as a psychologist and political psychologist and psychoanalyst, I'm afraid it's going to be very complicated.
Well, is it the case that there are still far too many people who believe that the solution to this problem is for the other side simply to disappear?
In a very, the human psyche is really quite fascinating because we can kind of split our consciousness into two independent parts. I think Palestinians know very well that Israelis are not going anywhere. And yet when you listen to Hamas, they actually still believe that one day they'll be able to drive us out. And yes, absolutely. I think that many Israelis wake up and say, maybe one day it'll just be gone. And partially that's out of the hatred that has accumulated on both sides, and part of it is because of the hopelessness and the disbelief that a solution that will allow each side to live both in dignity and security can actually be achieved.
Let me put something out here. I'm not going to stand behind this analysis, but I'm going to put it out there and you take it for what it's worth. But there's a line of argument that goes, the Camp David Accords could not have happened when they did in the late 1970s unless the quite disastrous for Israel Yom Kippur War in 1973 had previously taken place. Israel showed it wasn't this superstar giant. It couldn't win everything as easily as the Six-Day War, for example, in '67. It was vulnerable. For Palestinians to be able to recognize Israelis as peace partners, does Israel have to stop appearing, as it did in the '70s, as all-powerful?
The truth is I really don't know because, in a sense, I'm going to say something that I don't like saying. But you see, I think what happened was that between the 1980s and the early 2000s, the Palestinian generation grew up that really believed that they could win against Israel. And during the Second Intifada, when Sharon initiated Operation Defensive Shield, that was the first time when many young Palestinians actually experienced the IDF, the Israeli army, functioning as an army and not a policing force. And they realized how enormously strong this was. And I think it opened up something because I think as long as the Palestinians believe that they can win this using violence, this is not going to go anywhere. I think many Palestinians have come to that point. On the Israeli side, it is to realize that a little bit, exactly the opposite of what you said before, that Israel today does not really face existential danger the way it did in the 1960s and 1970s, and that we can take risks for peace. And that, unfortunately, is something that the Israeli right is not only not doing, but it is fanning the existential fears to the point of saying that there is no way that Israel can take these risks.
You're from Switzerland, yes?
Yes.
Switzerland's neutral.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm putting you in charge of fixing this then. Only a guy from a neutral country can do this. You're in charge.
Is that supposed to be Mission Impossible 5?
We shall see. Carlo Strenger from Tel-Aviv University, it's really good of you to spend so much time with us here today at TVO. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.